Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where in the world you are joining us today from. We are extremely thankful for you being here with us, be in person or virtually, for the launch of the Governance Action Hub. Special thanks for those of you that were able actually to join us in person today, right? Like you could very well have to stay home and join us virtually, but we promise we will make our best to respond to your interests. Thank you for being here. In a moment, I'm going to introduce properly Danny, right? And we're going to be having a conversation around governance, state capture, and climate change. But first, I just wanted to point out something. It is not a coincidence that we're meeting here, right? Like at the Open Gov Hub for the launch of a different hub. During the last 11 years, under the dedicated coordination of Global Integrity and Development Gateway, with Accountability Lab very much involved in a network of affiliated hubs, the Open Gov Hub has shown the way towards collaboration and reduction of silos. We will talk more about the Governance Action Hub, but why we start today talking about governance, climate change, and energy transition? No, it is not because all cool kids are talking about it, right? Like, but there is a reason why like it's so omnipresent right now. It's precisely because it is an urgent matter. It's because we have known for a while, right, like of the deep consequences that this has for people directly, for countries, for our activities, for our way of life, right? But it still seems that this urgency, this importance has only been like fully acknowledged, and sometimes it's still not fully acknowledged, sadly, in certain quarters, in recent times. It feels also that sometimes we only bring attention to this when there are tragedies, and those tragedies are happening very often. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And why is governance in the end so important in this conversation? We also see that in a way, it is also a catalyzing topic. People are concerned, especially when extreme climate occurrences affect their way of living. It is a problem that has only grown larger and more challenging, partially, we will argue, of governance failures and others, and state capture in particular. And it is a challenge where our efforts to tackle it will require us to deal with legacy challenges, which have weakened trust of people in their institutions, the democratic system, and the possibility of change. And to discuss more in detail the connection between governance, climate change, and energy transition, we're honored and thankful to have with us Danny Kaufman. Danny is an international leader in governance, anti-corruption, and natural resource management. He is a senior fellow with us at Resource for Development. He's also a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, chief advisor at Natural Resources Governance Institute, having served as its president and CEO from 2013 to 2020. And until recently, member of the EITI International Board. He has served as director of the World Bank Institute, where he pioneered approaches to measure, diagnose, and address governance and corruption, helping formulate action programs. Good morning, Danny. Good to be with you. Welcome to this lunch.
Thank you, Mario. Thanks to everybody being here. And greetings to you all. Off script, if you allow me, at the personal level, I cannot say good morning because it has been horrible. We all know what has happened in the Middle East in the face of utmost brutal crimes committed by terrorists, and that I think that's put things a bit in stark perspective. I know that we are going to address very important governance issues. In some sense, we're talking about the utmost failure in governance, but on the very tough and brutal side of governance that sometimes we don't fully deal with in these more lofty confines, and we do concentrate more on the soft side of governance. But I think what has happened, particularly on Shabbat in the Saturday massacre, reminds us that that there is evil in this world, which is not captured in our analytical work, in our data, in our initiatives, and it's beyond obviously the realistic scope of even an ambitious and important initiative that we're all launching today can hope with. I cannot help but being reminded by the noted Holocaust survivor philosopher Elie Wiesel, who famously said, after having witnessed and lived through the Holocaust, anything that is imaginable is possible. And I think this is a reminder, and obviously it's not the only such event. We have been faced with this event, where it's Putin in Bucha, in Ukraine, and of course, 9/11 more in the past. But I think it's a shock reminder to the system. Now, to link it to our conversation of what you may be asking me, these still at the model level trying to reflect on the role that our work in governance can play ahead, even in the context of this broader perspective of what has just happened. First, in terms of working on coalitions that was just mentioned, with the vast majority of citizens in the world that do not engage in the mass murder of babies and mothers and others, and believe in humankind, even if we agree to disagree. And there are many such venues. But then related to that is to think much harder about the role of prevention. And in that context, data and analytics can, what we have been doing with the worldwide governance indicators and so on, provide, and has provided in the past, early flags of countries that are descending into quasi-failure or failed states, which we are dealing with right now in the case of the Middle East, but also in other areas of the world that can then create the conditions for this type of massive. And last but not least, then we'll get into our own path that you have in mind, Mariam, is to think harder perhaps as to how to engage even within the governance action hub with some post-conflict settings. So prevention, on the one hand, it's incredibly difficult, and it's another kind of, basically, another type of challenge to engage in places that are in the midst of conflict. There, we can do very little. This is being dealt by others right now. But what about pre-conflict and descent? How to avoid the descent into this madness, and then in terms of the post-conflict. But thanks for the space to provide this, because I thought it was important to bear in mind that it's a larger perspective that at least to many of us are very traumatic.
Absolutely, and thank you very much, Danny, for keeping us grounded also, and acknowledging what is happening around us, right? Like, and those roots and connections also between what is happening around the world, and also the kind of work that we do more broadly in the governance space. One of the things that we have been discussing a lot, like we have discussed personally in the past, and that is very much present in our conversations with different stakeholders, not only here, but in the context, most importantly, is this sense of urgency, particularly around issues that affect directly people, right? Related, for example, with climate change. We have been working for the last few years, as Gina mentioned, right, in this program, FDRC, with Brookings Institution, very much focused on the extractive sector, right? Like, but we understood, like, over time also, and in the discussion about this program, how the governance challenges that condition and that lead to that particular challenges in the extractive sector are much larger systemic, right? Like, and require like a very strong approach to collaboration around. What we see in general is that we think is that our diagnostic is that any action like towards climate change and its consequences is gonna like very much be weakened by an existing and prevailing lack of confidence of people, right? Even among professionals like us many times, right? In our institutions or in the possibility of change, right? Like, do you personally share this diagnosis? What is it that we need more in this space, in the governance and anti-corruption?
Well, I think, again, this week and what has happened also with the war, the brutal war of Putin in Ukraine, reminds us that urgency is crucial here. And nothing stops for considering very urgent on the side of evil. So the forces of evil have no qualms about operating with extreme urgency. The evidence shows very clear that over the past, essentially since 2006, there's been a democratic decline in terms of democratic institutions, civic space, and all that around the world. And if anything, that has sped up over the past year or two for reasons that are well known. We don't need to get into that. This is also very much related to obviously geopolitics, but also to the rise of content. And that, so the sense of urgency should be shared by the side of good, not only by the side of evil. And urgency, there is an urgency. What is a logical implication? Since we, the reasonable people in the middle, are so far behind the other forces, and the decline that is clear, then as we have written about, and we did a survey about it a couple of years ago, clearly suggested that more audacity is needed. So if it can be encapsulated in one notion, I would say we need a major dose of additional audacity. Not just ambition, but being audacious about our initiatives, what we do, being clear that as a result, because they ask, the audacity and the ambition is going to be much higher. The probability of success is going to be much lower. But that's where the donors also come in terms of how do they regard a successful program or not. If, let me submit, and I had this argument forever when I used to be at the World Bank, where there was an extremely rigorous and they still is evaluation department, and I looked at all the data in terms of what projects were successful, unsuccessful, and so on. And the aim was to maximize the success of projects. And the case I made was that if we go beyond 80 to 85%, we are not taking enough risk. We are cherry picking and we're not doing enough. So I think being audacious, coupled with the recognition that that means that we're going to have failures, we're going to learn also from failures, but also when we have a success, the payoff is going to be so much larger than from those safe cherry-picked programs where it would be incremental progress, which nowadays, given the challenges around the world.
Thank you, Danny, for that. And if I may remind for everybody here in the room, but also for those that are joining us online, please, if you have any questions that are arising based on the conversation, anything you always wanted to ask about governance and climate change and energy transition and you didn't have a chance to, please go ahead. We're happy to actually try to answer or start pointing to certain responses about. And what we'll do is like at the end of the conversation, towards the end of the conversation, we're gonna see if we have a few questions and we'd be happy to respond to those. Danny, sorry.
No, thank you for this, because I hope also in our conversation, there is frankness and audacity on our side, because I don't think this is a time for political correctness. And let me just add on the issue of audacity.
Yeah.
I mean, the audacity is an incredible display by the forces of evil. I mean, look what Putin has done, what Hamas, and I know they will mention many others, and also at the softer levels and political parties and how they function and so on. Yet, on our side, we have remained relatively tame and conservative, and that's what comes out from our survey. It's not just us saying, we had what, 400 respondents throughout the national resource governance field and beyond, also in others. And basically, the notion was, well, we don't think there is hope for a lot of progress. We need progress, we need reforms. The probability and likelihood of reform is low. And so let's be modest in terms of our ask, in terms of our ambition. And frankly, among ourselves, this was not just the respondents from multilateral organizations and from governments. It's not that surprising, but equally from civil society at the time. So that notion of the dose of more ambition and audacity was lacking there. It's not lacking on the other side.
Yeah, I think I guess that is great, that counter that you make between ambition and audacity. So I think particularly that focus on action. I also feel that, as you were saying, right, like the other team, right, like the other people that is like engaged in corruption or are benefiting from the status quo, they play a different game to us, like in terms of incentives, in terms of like our possibility of actually motivating and pushing for change. Partially because like the way that we're approaching many programs in development is very much project-based, and don't necessarily, despite the fact that we know this and we talk about this, and we have been talking about years about this, we need some room for more testing, experimentation, but very substantial learning that moves us forward, that is based and focused on action. And we talk a lot about like raising voices, and I guess that raising voices is fantastic. I guess that we need also to be more intentional about raising and identifying and stimulating ideas particularly from local stakeholders. And there has been a lot of conversation about this. A couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be at Climate Week, right? Like with many colleagues, right? Like from companies, from private sector, from international development, right? And everybody seems very clear and very agreeing, aligned in terms of like, yeah, we need to actually like put people in the middle, in the center, right, of the action, right? But the how, based on the structure that we have, is not so clear. Let me go back, particular to one idea that you were actually one of the ones generating or like steering a lot of conversation about it, like what, 22 years ago, right? Which is specifically about state capture, right? Like in the work that you did at the time with Joel Hellman. Like, I have known you for years, but it's like we have had more of like a close relationship and engagement only a few years ago. But I got to know actually you and your work through that particular kind of work. And I feel that particularly in the last few years, our mention everywhere about state capture, it completely just went beyond the academic or the theoretical or the discussion, right, on a paper from the World Bank, right? And it's there. Sometimes we don't call it like that, but in our engagement in countries with local stakeholders, it comes out, right? Like these challenges, this lack of trust, even sometimes in traditional leaders that have always been like the anchor, right? In many ways of like the last remnant of trust between people in institutions, being formal and informal. Tell us a little bit about like, how do you feel that this discussion around state capture has evolved? How has it manifested in the work that we do in this space? You have been part of the IPI, you have been pushing a lot of excellent work from NRGI that now Sunita Kamal has continued. Like, how do you feel about it? How do you see the target? How we make progress? What else should we be doing?
Okay, thanks, Mike. Fast rewind, and to make it very clear, I think the only way I've ever been able to make progress is through collective action. Basically, in terms of the analytical work, in terms of the empirical work, in terms of all this innovation, was always with somebody else. I think having a joint project makes a difference. One of us could have made more of a push at the beginning, but then working together is absolutely crucial. So thank you for mentioning this, but this is not about an individual. So first, let's rewind. After we started with our trade, the governance indicator, and I had been also very involved with the former Soviet Union, having been the first head of the World Bank in Ukraine right after independence started. Then I met Joel Hellman, who was working on Russia, and we shared his observation that the whole study and the approach, very tame again, about corruption, was something major. The whole approach about corruption and governance, the little that was being done about governance at the time, basically was trying to figure out how people just get around the existing rules of the game in the country and the institutions to benefit themselves. But what we posited is that something much more nefarious is those potentates, those extremely undue influential people shape the rules of the game for their own benefit and shape the institution at a cost and then consequences for society that could be manifold, just getting around and getting a transaction with a bribery and so on. So that motivated it, and we decided at the time, and also with our prayer on the governance indicator was taboo to measure all these things. In fact, at the World Bank there was no yet authorizing environment. Then Jim Wilkinson came and gave us authorization to work on those things. But I had started by stealth in Ukraine with some colleagues, and thanks to a minister, a very young minister, I started doing surveys, and then I got scolded by the chief counsel of the World Bank. But thanks to the cover of that, and that's how we started, because we challenged the whole notion that the whole field of governance and corruption was not subject to measurement. And that's basically, it's one little kernel of audacity, but we were not. That was not audacity putting our lives at risk like others do. We were putting only our jobs at risk. And then, so we started with that. At the time, it got a lot of attention for the former Soviet Union, it was a 4 countries in transition. And over time, it has gotten a bit of traction, sometimes more recently more, other times less. The case of South Africa is very interesting, and I had to go before the National Commission, the Zondo Commission, basically for hours and hours, to testify about what it means in the rest of the world and so on. They didn't talk throughout the commission for all the work about what had happened with the former president and with the Gupta gate and so on. They didn't talk about corruption. They talked only about state capture. So that got some attention, increasingly in Latin America and other countries. So that has got some attention. But let's face it, these are very sensitive issues. So there's a lot of pushback from some quarters, from some political quarters, from government and so on. So when we embrace this type of work, we don't win any popularity contest. It's different than education for all and so on, which we all believe in. But if there is no governance, it's state capture. Forget education for all. Forget the results on health. But the framework and the lens of state capture has helped me and has helped us in different contexts. And let me give the example of EITI, a very concrete and specific level. Two episodes in EITI, very far apart. 7, 8 years ago, there was complete pushback from the other constituencies. I was representing one person representing civil society. There are constituencies. No, why should civil society have particular protections and safeguards and so on? This is just about ensuring transparency. We made a case that accountability, participation were absolutely crucial to get results. It was considered that we cannot get particular protections and safeguards for civil society. We did analytical work. We showed, we did a board meeting where we presented with data the link between voice and accountability on the other hand, and the effectiveness of transparency and anti-corruption on the other one. Bottom line, we got protections and safeguards for civil society and prerequisites for entry into the idea that you have to comply at least with sufficient protection for civic space and civil society. Much more recent, just a couple of months ago, we were together at the big forum in Dakar, where the new standard, every 3-4 years, there's a new standard of the EITI, totally refreshed. It was considered inconceivable just a year and a half ago that energy transition and addressing climate change could be part of EITI, whose remit was considered to be totally different. And when I re-entered the board, which I did over the past year, I was asked to do that for particular circumstances. I was told you have to be realistic, because they know that I like audacity. You have to be realistic. We cannot achieve much on this and so on. I didn't listen. I had an ally or two of there. We pushed until the last second. We got energy transition. The companies now have to report on greenhouse gas emissions at the very detailed project level, not now, but it will be in the future, but this has been adopted now. And the same about subsidies, about reserves and things that were considered totally ineffective. So yes, it can be done. And the link between the two is that rather than embracing a very soft version of collective action, where we think that everybody will work together and we have the same aim, different stakeholders. No, we don't. Everybody has their own interests. It's understanding that set of interests and understanding that particularly all the big oil companies were engaged in capture. And therefore we had to think, go back to the drawing board and think, what's our strategy to counter that specter of capture? No, we're not talking about national level, but even at an initiative level. I think those are lessons, and then I don't want to go much longer there, but it's to put it out there that in terms of the governance action hub and thinking, of course, each context will be different. We need to embrace to a large degree to think about, okay, what are the incentives of each actor in this case, and how do we make it coalesce and get to some compromise? Very hard-nosed negotiations will be needed and so on, rather than embracing the notion that we'll all be sitting around the table and it's very, very nice and lovely collective action. If that happens, then we don't have everybody in that room.
That's so important, actually, the point, right? Like, because sometimes precisely because we are so committed to the idea of making things happen. When we are trying to make things happen, we're trying not to necessarily like upset people, right? Like, or have conflict, like in the conversations, when conflict in different interests are part of the thing. I mean, like, precisely. And I truly believe that it's like in the world that we're doing, the next challenge is going to be truly effective, to be able to be more inclusive, but that means also like broadening this coalition work. Not being afraid of conflict, even though it may actually derail or it may actually take longer to achieve things, right? Like, but hopefully what we are doing by doing that is precisely like motivate more lasting also action, like something that people can commit to over time. This is very important, Danny. I have two more very quick questions, right? Like, we were talking about EITI, we're talking about energy transition as a standard. Like, would you say that the state capture is part of the reason why our reaction to climate change that has been in the conversation out there has been quite slow, to be very honest, or like pushback.
Sure. By the way, just to dovetail on what you said and what we just discussed on the ITI, not only in the new standard, there are very important additional components and and requirements on energy transition, but they are on anti-corruption and on gender empowerment, which all of those were considered unthinkable a few years back. So yes, it can be done. Now, regarding state capture,
State capture in climate change.
in climate change, absolutely. Just to be clear, and that has been part of the confusing evolution of the notion. When we started talking about state capture in shaping the rules of the game, it was by the extremely unduly influential non-state actor. Okay, that was basically what we developed with Joel Hellman. And over time, this has been broadened, and political scientists have embraced the notion that that can happen also by politicians and by state leaders. So in some sense, we meant by state capture is capture of the state by non-state actors. But they also can be captured by the state. If, like the case of Putin is emblematic, and what's happening with Orban and other such cases around the world. Now, that's fine. And in fact, in an initiative that you are supporting, I'm engaged in coming up with an index of state capture for the whole world, including both capture of the state and capture by the state. But it's very important to distinguish between the two notions and the two regimes, because the implications for strategy and policy are vastly different. What do you do with a state leader, with a Putin who has captured, versus what you do with ExxonMobil and so on. So those are completely different type of issue. Now, obviously, in natural resource space, the notion of state capture is absolutely critical to understand what are the obstacles for the energy transition. Let's mince no words, and it was so clear in our negotiations regarding the new standard. Industry in natural resources is very heterogeneous, like civil society is heterogeneous, governments are heterogeneous, all states are more heterogeneous within. The mining companies, with a few exceptions, were very progressive and were our allies. The oil companies were divided. The big oil basically was very resistant, and it still is, and they do engage in certain tactics and strategies that could be considered capturing them. I mean, they do join some of these initiatives. Chevron, by the way, just decided to leave the ITI, and that's a sign of the times. Some of these big oil companies are taking their gloves off right now and saying, okay, energy transition, I will invest in renewables and blah, blah, blah. But we are not really seriously getting out of fossil fuels, right? And that some are saying it very frankly and transparently, and good for them. And sometimes Chevron leaving, it is a transparent move than greenwashing those that don't do that. Others don't do it. To understand that, because this whole notion and literature on state capture is extremely important, because it poses a huge obstacle. And that's also a message for the larger world and for the donor community, which often says, no, we're not working on natural resources anymore. Now we're only working on climate change or Ukraine or whatever the fact of the moment is. When in fact, arguably, there's no more important thing for climate change than to solve the governance problem in natural resources, precisely because of what we're talking about. If we don't unlock the real obstacles to the energy transition, which reside with governance and state capture, the progress, we're not going to get there. Forget 1.5, even 2 degrees. So I think we need the natural resource governance community needs to make a better case as to the absolutely intimate linkage between both. It's not either or. We're not going to get there if we don't address governance.
Thank you, Danny. We're almost out of time, but just wanted to ask you, like, any recommendation, particularly for the work that not only us from the Action Hub, but it's like also many of our colleagues that are here or online, like should be looking at, particularly at the country level in terms of engagement.
So you mean like country examples?
Yeah, or recommendations in any case of how to approach the board. You actually talk about collaboration, right? Like how collaboration is really a serious thing, right? Especially if we want to do it. But it may be actually difficult to actually like launch and do it precisely because we are typically bounded by like the limits of our project, the time frames that we may have.
Right.
But these processes may actually take longer than that we wish or expect.
Processes do always take longer than we think, and than any political or funding sector. So that's very important. I think it's very important to think about a basket of diverse countries and some will be much high risk but high reward, and others not so much. Of course, I'm biased. My own country is Chile. And Chile could be a fascinating case, perhaps, to work with. I'm heading to Chile in a few days to a conference and to work there, and it's related to also lithium and so on. Chile is joining the EITI finally. Now, I think the biggest deal, and of course, I'm an arrogant Chilean, the biggest deal about Chile joining is the contribution that these countries can make to the field, rather than the way around. So to work with some of these countries, which in many ways are showing the art of the possible in the South, and have South-South collaboration and South-South lessons is very important. And I think, of course, Chile has hiccups, so it's far from perfect and so on, but it's at a different place totally nowadays, thanks to good policies matched with natural resources, as opposed to most other natural resource rich countries. But then we cannot avoid the world. Why not at the right moment also engage with the Ukrainians of this world, or even Lebanon? There's many potential collaborators and fantastic people and institutions in those very, very difficult settings that I think should be also tapped and helped. And last but not least, to engage with some of these international initiatives. I know that you're already very much working with EITI and considering how to help in that. So there you can cover more countries, but also in the context of now the implementation of this very ambitious new standard. The new standard for EITI was just adopted. Implementation would be a matter.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Danny. Let me just quickly check. Do we have any questions in the room first that you would like to follow up with Danny about this issue? Lior.
I'm taking myself for the question. Hi, I'm Lior Miller, and I am a program director at R4D, and happy to collaborate on the Governance Action Hub. And my question is, you talk about, state capture, and we work with a lot of civil society organizations at R4D and in the work I do, and other partners. And what about elite capture when you're engaging with local partners and civil society organizations? It can be very hard to make sure that you are really kind of reaching, collaborating with, empowering, you mentioned gender empowerment, with underrepresented groups, be that women, youth, any marginalized group, and that can vary by country. And then you mentioned greenwashing, and then the existence of we call AstroTurf organizations, right? So that's another issue. So, you know, and I'm very interested in particular in issues around gender and gender-based violence. And so how, you know, what have you seen as good or not so successful approaches to ensuring that, yes, we want collaboration, we want to work with local partners, but how do you know that you, especially as an outside maybe group coming in or a collaborator, that you really are reaching those partners and those voices? Thank you.
Well, some of the answer you and Mario, Gina, and company I know I've been working on and have many examples. We did something similar many years ago when we started to complement these broad indicators around the world, which I was the person saying, this is a first cut and this is useful to monitor and to compare, but it doesn't help. Within the country, what do they do about it? So basically an approach was created of in-country, country-led by all stakeholders getting together and say how we're going to diagnose the very specific challenges we have. People were working for months around different tables of different issues, representing the localities, representing all kinds of groups, and coming up with some action plan. And that's done more nowadays. That's not universal yet, but basically much more of the bottom up and recognition that you need to embrace the part, because otherwise the so-called INGO capture, basically, I think there has been enough pushback and recognition that ought not to happen. And part of your program that I think everybody will talk about, you're going to talk about in the next few hours, is to go to the locality and start with the bottom up. So I think we need to keep it up to the mind, and that the notion of elite capturing is absolutely right. If we were here until midnight and we want to talk all the time about state capture, I'll welcome that some other day, and I'll voice my opinion about other related notions of capture, including, I think, because I'm very interested in psychology, the notion of cognitive capture. What happened in Wall Street and the Wall Street crash and the financial crash was both state capture, but the cognitive capture of how the old boys network function in Wall Street and so on, the hubris and so on. It's at the military intelligence level, which is being discussed now, that can also happen. So there are all kinds of related notions that I'm glad that you brought up, elite capture and so on, that it's part of that, the broader dimensions of this concept.
Thank you very much. We're out of time, but I wanted to acknowledge one question, particularly on political economy analysis that came out, right? Like, and we'll talk a little bit about this also, right? Like political economy analysis, particularly that leads to action. But Danny, I just wanted to acknowledge your time and thank you for coming and sharing these ideas with us. Of course, other people here during the coffee break and online can send us questions for later. We'll be happy to follow up with Danny on an answer about many of those. But for now, if you can help me just thank Danny with